Hi again, back by semi-popular demand, chapter 3 now of Fareed Zakaria's The Post-American World. This is the third chapter. It's called A Non-Western World, and we're going to explore the first part of it, the first half, which will take us from pages 49, where the chapter begins, through 69. So we're going to stop before this section called Westernization. Zakaria starts out by comparing Christopher Columbus and Zhang He, or Zhang Hao. You all remember him from World History 1, great Chinese sailor. His question, which is the question a lot of people have asked, is why, if China has these great flotillas and can go out and explore and do all this trading, doesn't it? On the other hand, Christopher Columbus heads off across the Atlantic with a teeny little boat. So why, this is about Europe, and why does Europe rise at just the moment when China decides to turn inwards? So that whole first 2 pages is a discussion or a description of those Chinese ships and what was going on. What explains the remarkable turnaround, he asks us on 51. He's saying that it's not just sort of a momentary decision where they decided not to make these ships anymore or something else. He's describing it as an expression of a civilization's stagnation. Behind the decision to end the expeditions lay a whole complex of reasons why China and most of the non-Western world lagged behind the Western world for so many centuries. So that's his question. Now, on pages 52 and 53 and into 54, he's going to just spend some time arguing with some historians. And in particular, he's after this guy who argued that the West rose basically because of coal and colonies, that England in particular happened to have coal that was available and went out and plundered colonies. And he's saying that's actually not the case. This is a very interesting historiographical discussion, in other words, a fight between historians about what's really going on, and we can explore it some more in class. The important point here, though, is it doesn't really matter. What matters is that Zakaria is saying the West has been dominant for 500 years, for half a millennium, and the rest of the world, his rising rest, have been quiet or asleep or dormant for those 500 years. And so that's what he does now on 52 and 53. I'm not going to go into it too much, but it's interesting to begin to explore Zakaria's bias or his perspective on things. And I noticed, for example, on page 55, he says the tide began to turn in the 15th century, and by the 16th century, Europe had moved ahead. And now he's going to explain to us about Europe moving ahead. He says, to believe that Asian societies were in any material sense on par with the West in 1700 or 1800 is to believe that the scientific and technological advances that revolutionized the Western world over the preceding 300 years had no effect on its material condition, which is absurd. Notice that there's no actual argument there. All he's doing is telling you that to suggest, even though I'm not proving it, that science and technology didn't have a big impact on people's lives, well, that's just craziness. Okay, so notice that he doesn't give us much explanation. By the same token, he's going to spend the next couple of pages giving us some more examples of Western technology, and he's very interested in the clock. He says things like this in the middle of page 56 at the end of the paragraph. Before the clock, time had no measurable value. I find that a very interesting statement, that this machine created a measurable value for labor time. Okay, so I want you to think carefully about those few pages and his argument there. The next section begins on 57, called Strength is Weakness. And here he says, how do we make sense of the extraordinary Chinese voyages? His argument now, and he discusses it in the context of India and China, is that even though there was this incredible feat, and even though there were fantastic things like the Taj Mahal built in India, really they were just massive outlays of wealth by a command economy. In other words, by the central government. And you'll notice that he's becoming very interested in the difference between societies and countries where there's a strong central government and societies where there is a free market and competition and all these other nice things. Okay, so that's what he does in the next couple of pages. He tries to explain to us that even though there were these remarkable voyages, they don't mean what you might think they mean. In other words, they don't mean that China was highly advanced. Okay, all right. Next section, is culture destiny? Is culture destiny? This is his question. And it's an interesting one because on the one hand, China's been dormant for 500 years. And you could turn around and say, well, that's because they're Chinese and because of Confucianism and so forth. But if that's the case, how do you explain the fact that China is now a rising power? They're still Chinese. Confucianism is still pretty important and just as important as it ever was. So how, if culture is what drives history, is China going from being dominant to not dominant to dominant again? How come India goes from being asleep for so long to becoming this rising power? And he gives us this quote by Daniel Patrick Moynihan. It's on the bottom of page 61. He says, the central conservative truth is that culture, not politics, determines the success of society. The central liberal truth is that politics can change culture and save it from itself. And now here's what Zakaria says. That gets it just about right. In other words, he's arguing that there can be political changes that shape the culture and turn a culture, a whole nation, a nation in the cultural sense, from a bunch of dormant sleepers ruled by a command economy into this vibrant, exciting, free marketplace that the West has become. Okay. So he argues that centralization is very important. Why, he asks on 63, why was this type of centralized state being limited and constrained in Europe, even as it flourished in much of the non-Western world? He argues that, one, there's the Christian church, and that was a countervailing influence or a balancing influence. Two, that there was a landed elite, Europe's landed elite or aristocracy, which balanced the king. And so you didn't have as powerful a central state because of these more powerful nobles that were around. And then he talks about geography. Europe is broken up by wide rivers, tall mountains, and large valleys, he says on 63. Okay? So notice that he's asking a question and he's giving us three responses. The next section is called the spoils of victory, and here it is simply about contact with the non-European world. So this is Columbus and all the others. And his argument is that they benefit greatly from that. There's two things going on there. One is you get lots of resources, everything from gold to sugar and fish and so forth. But also that America becomes an escape valve for Europe. So any conflict, any political conflict within Europe now has a release. You don't like it in Europe, you can go to America. Okay, so that's it. That's 8.5 minutes on the first half of chapter 3. We'll pick up next time with westernization. Don't forget, this doesn't substitute for reading, and it doesn't substitute for using those reading guides. Bye-bye.